Yeah, we are live on YouTube as well as on Zoom. Welcome to the live session for the course Aspects of Cultural Studies. Our instructors, Professor P. Dalai sir and Professor Dhriti Ray Dalai ma'am is here along with the TA Aparna. Students, you can join directly on Zoom and ask the questions, or else you can watch the event on YouTube and post your queries on the YouTube chat. So let's begin, ma'am. Sir, let's begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Murali Krishnan, for facilitating this live session right from IIT Kanpur. This is Professor P. Dalai, one of the course instructors of this course called Cultural Studies, Aspects of Cultural Studies. With me is another co-instructor, Dr. Dhriti Ray Dalai. I'll come back to provide a brief outline of the course that we have already floated. Before that, I would request the co-instructor, Professor Dhriti Ray Dalai, to introduce her and also thank the participants who have joined in our course. Over to Professor Dalai.
Good afternoon to all of you. This is Dr. Dhriti Ray Dalai, Professor, Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University, the co-instructor of this particular course, Aspects of Cultural Studies. And I take this opportunity to thank all the people who have registered for this course and who have also turned up online to be part of this interactive session. Now over to Professor Dalai once again to provide you all with an overview of this particular course. Over to you, Professor Dalai.
Thank you, Professor Dhriti Dalai. You see, as you have already gone through the 4 weeks videos of our 20 lectures that we had, shared with you, and these 20 lectures were divided into 4 weeks. So mathematically, then each week had 5 lectures, and in these 20 lectures or during these 4 weeks, dear participants, you might have learned about the basic aspects of cultural studies. Nevertheless, let me contextualize or reiterate the importance of this course in a brief manner. In the first week, our task was to introduce you with the introductory aspects of cultural studies. And we had delivered 5 lectures. In the first lecture, I gave you the basic introduction to what is cultural studies, though what is cultural studies was narrated again in another lecture in week 3. In the second lecture, I gave you the basic backgrounds or the different backgrounds, different formations, different intellectual traditions that paved the way for the emergence of cultural studies or the necessity of cultural studies. Lecture 2 was quite significant, my dear students and participants, in the sense that hardly do you find, lectures going into the details of these different formations. Stuart Hall actually refers to these different formations, but he never explains these different backgrounds or different traditions that the BCCS or the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies actually borrowed from. In this lecture, therefore, we introduced you with phenomenology, with the great intellectual shift from positivism to post-positivism, with the emergence of the new world experiences and issues, like, for example, you had Hungarian Revolution, you had Bolshevism, you had Suez Canal crisis, you had the nuclear tests, you had the multicultural problem, racial problem, gender problem, sexualities, or the protest by the LGBTQ. We also, in this second lecture, spoke about how translations were also significant in the promotion in the emergence of cultural studies. We also spoke about feminism and about many other traditions, intellectual traditions, schools of thought, or philosophies, or theories, or practices, or world experiences that actually gave birth to cultural studies. My dear students, I am reiterating it, and let me use the word again, that this lecture is quite significant because this is a holistic view of the rise and the emergence and the importance and the applicability of cultural studies. Besides this, in the first week, we also spoke about different schools of cultural studies. Let me remind you, we spoke about the Frankfurt School in Germany. We spoke about the BCCS in Britain. And also, in the first week, we spoke about the key words and the key concepts that actually we come across or encounter when we try to learn, understand, or practice or theorize cultural studies. So the first week, therefore, concentrated on the basics of cultural studies, and these basics were restricted or confined to introductory part or introductory basics of cultural studies. Now, these basic traditions were further elaborated in the second week. For example, in the first week, we spoke about how there was one experience of problems with old Marxism and then rise of new Marxism and other things. Now, these new experiences that we spoke in the first week were again explained through separate lectures in lecture 2. For example, in lecture 1 of week 2, we spoke about the rise of the New World Order or experiences and its interface with cultural studies. This is lecture 6, or the first lecture of week 2. And also in lecture 7, that is lecture 2 of the second week, lecture 2 of week 2, or simply lecture 7 of the entire course, we spoke about problems of old Marxism and the New World Order. How there were problems with the old Marxist philosophies and practices, and how that led to the urgency of the organic intellectualism, which Antonio Gramsci was speaking about, and how this idea of organic intellectualism or the problems of old Marxism were, tackled by or were understood and also were, encountered by the cultural studies group. Then again, in this lecture, week 2, we spoke about the rise of the new left and the rise of cultural interest, therefore, against the old Marxists. There was rise of the new leftists who discarded the old principles of old Marxists and brought forth the new ways of dealing with social issues or social problems. The new left would come not only as a group, but as a concept, and that would give birth to the what is called organic intellectualism. So you have Stuart Hall, E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams, Richard Hogarth, and many others in this group. In week 2, we also spoke about, in a separate lecture, the importance of organic intellectualism or organic intellectuals. And this lecture, which is lecture 9 of week 2, especially dealt with what or who is an organic intellectual, what are the necessities of organic intellectuals, who gave this concept of organic intellectualism, or how organic intellectualism can be best suited for cultural praxis or practices of cultural studies. And most significantly, my dear students and participants, we also spoke on the trinity of cultural studies, the founding fathers of cultural studies, as Bill Schwartz would speak about. And I have already mentioned Bill Schwartz's article name, and I've also explained who were these trinities of trinity of cultural studies. Particularly, we spoke about Richard Hogarth, known for his book called The Uses of Literacy, Raymond Williams, his theory of culture, culture and society, and E.P. Thompson, who gave the concept of the working class history or history from below. These were considered, Richard Hogarth, Raymond Williams, and E.P. Thompson were considered as the trinity of cultural studies. So with this lecture, that is lecture 10, week 2 ended. Now in week 3, we try to explain further to be elaborative. Otherwise, usually in different forums, you find lectures that are not very self-explanatory, that are not very elaborative, that are not very deep in its explanations and in its historical analysis of the origin and the development and its contextualities. So in the first lecture, or that is lecture 11 of week 3, we spoke about Stuart Hall and his contributions to cultural studies. His 90 essays and 92 essays, Cultural Studies and its Theoretical Legacies, Cultural Studies and the Crisis in Humanities. All these essays, through these essays, and particularly his idea of circuit of culture, his idea of what is called an articulation theory, all these we have discussed. So this is how he would contribute, or he would leave certain conceptual foundation to understand what cultural studies is. So in lecture 11, that is first lecture of week 3, we spoke about Stuart Hall and his cultural studies. Then in the next lecture, that is lecture 12, we spoke about the conjectures of cultural studies, historical and philosophical context, and we spoke on the phenomenology. My dear students, colleagues, and participants, you would understand the importance of phenomenology in cultural studies from this lecture. Usually, as a philosophical tradition and theory and practice or school of thought, phenomenology is restricted to philosophy department. We hardly talk about phenomenology in its philosophical entirety in English classrooms or in other classrooms. So we thought it was of paramount importance to take you to the phenomenological school of thought so that you can relate how culture can be best studied, or how we can do cultural analysis relying on phenomenology, or how phenomenology is the mother of cultural analysis and other theories and critical thoughts also. And it was not out of the context, because Stuart Hall and other cultural theorists would directly or indirectly borrow the phenomenological processes and thoughts from the school of phenomenology. We don't come across cultural theorists elaborately speaking on phenomenology. So it is, in my humble confession, and probably you would agree, that this lecture was quite helpful for you as students of literature and other disciplines outside the philosophy department, that how it would have enriched your critical thinking about cultural analysis, even phenomenology as a process and as a thought. So like the second lecture, this lecture in my evaluation was also another new addition to the cultural studies courses. Then we also, another contribution to cultural studies courses, and our attempt here in this novel endeavor was to introduce you with the shift, intellectual shift from the positivist school to post-positivist school. And this is something that sociologists do in the sociology departments. You hardly come across, the cultural theorists and the teachers or instructors bringing this connection, intellectual connections between post-positivism and cultural studies. Post-positivism was a departure from the positivist methods, experimentations, formulations, theories, all such things. Scientificity. Post-positivism was a departure, giving therefore space to people's perceptions, people's feelings, people's appreciations, responses as the real methods or processes of making meaning. So culture then becomes an open end in post-positivist perspective, and culture becomes an open object to be analyzed phenomenologically. As we see, as we think, as we feel, as we perceive, as we critique. So like phenomenology, this shift, intellectual shift from positivism to post-positivism in week 3 was another new addition to the cultural studies courses or course that we have imparted. So unlike the other courses on cultural studies, it would enrich further in addition to the courses that you learn from other cultural studies. This lecture would enhance you, or rather let you know how you also need to know this intellectual shift from, for example, from Karl Marx or from Auguste Comte or from Herbert Spencer or from Emile Durkheim to Karl Popper, Karl Mannheim, Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, the post-positivist. So as an English, students from the English department or from humanities or non-sociology department, this might have been very helpful for you if at all you were a keen and attentive listener of this course or these video lectures. Anyway, most significantly, my dear students, in week 3, we provided you with the features or the characteristics of cultural studies. Like we did in the first lecture, introductory lecture. What is cultural studies? In lecture 14, that is in week 3, we also spoke about what does cultural studies actually do, wherein we touched upon the processes, some methods, some objectives of cultural studies. So in a way, you can directly come back to this lecture 14 to know what cultural studies is, to attempt an answer in the test or in the future or as a teacher or as a participant. So it's in nutshell. Then we move to the last lecture of, we move to the week through the last lecture, that is lecture 15. That is the last lecture that is lecture 15 of week 3 was on new age creativity and cultural studies. My dear students and participants, let me humbly confess, the novelty of this course that we have offered lies in bringing in new dimensions or unexplored areas of cultural studies. Like we did with phenomenology, with shift from positivism to post-positivism. This lecture 15 was based on new age creativity and cultural studies. We very rarely and passingly refer to certain examples from new age creativity, but we do not elaborately, theoretically, systematically delve into this new age creativity. We may cite examples from social media, but we have never been able to associate social media as a domain of new age creativity and its relationship with cultural studies. So this lecture is also again new in understanding cultural studies. And this is where again the novelty of this course lies. And there are so many researches, so many debates and discussions, theorizations going on in the area of new age creativity, particularly that we find in the digital world, in social media and other digital forums like Facebook, like YouTube, like Twitter, like many other things, and that are new digital areas or mediums that would also arise. So there are so many things, my dear students, in this course for you for the first time. And if at all in future, you find time to go through my courses, our courses, you should feel happy to go through these courses to learn newer aspects, novel aspects, unexplored aspects. Basically, the traditions, the formulations, the schools of thoughts that were instrumental and that have been instrumental in cultural studies. So we move to week 4. In week 4, lectures 16 and lecture 17 were based on animal studies. Lecture 18 and lecture 19 were based on disability studies. Lecture 20, the last lecture of this entire course, that is lecture 20, was based on food and cultural studies. Culinary studies, how food is related to our identity, our caste, our religion, even our nationalism and gender has been explored. And this lecture 20 is one of the 5 examples that you have in week 4. So these 5 lectures in week 4 are demonstrations of how you can think of researches in cultural studies. Food, obviously, I have spoken about, explained how it is related to religion, to caste, to nationalism, to texts, to practices and many other things. So this is how we thought, both me and Professor Dhriti Dalai thought of not only giving lectures on the theoretical aspects of cultural studies, but also to give lectures or demonstrate how cultural studies can be followed to do researches in the area of animal studies, in the area of disability studies, and in the area of food, even other areas too that you can think of. With this, I now invite the co-instructor, Professor Dhriti Dalai, to elaborate or to give a brief estimation of her lectures, lecture number 16, 17, 18, and 19, that she delivered in the last week of this course, or the week 4 of this course. Over to Professor Dalai.
Thank you, Prof.P. Dalai. Like Professor Dalai has been telling you about how he has unraveled the various aspects of cultural studies.
Ma'am, audio is not coming, ma'am. I think you're muted, ma'am.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Now you are audible, ma'am.
Okay. Yes, audible and visible as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So if I could just ask you to unmute yourself, Eco.
Unmute.
Yeah, mute yourself. Okay. So what I tried to bring in to this particular course was the possibility of exploring the possibility of having new categories being added. For example, species. If we could think of species as a category which could be added to an existing list of identity categories like race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., etc. My lecture was also trying to highlight the contentious and debatable field of animal studies, which has evolved recently. And there are quite a few questions related to the animal question. So I've tried to answer those questions to the best of my ability. Like, what are the similarities and differences between, say, us humans and animals? Are not animals the only category to be fitted in humans are not animals themselves? Should there be an ethical treatment of animals? To be treated justly, should animals possess the capacity for language and rational thought? In due course of my lecture, I've fallen back on the principal suggestions and observations made by someone like Peter Singer, Tom Regan. I have also talked about a definitive animal turn which has taken place in critical discourse. And I have fallen back on the findings of Kerry Whale, who in Thinking Animals, Why Animal Studies Now, has identified this animal turn. Along with Kerry Whale, there is also Richard Grusin, who has significantly identified a non-human turn as well. Now, by this non-human turn, he proclaims that this turn is not specifically towards the animals. It could be towards technology as well. So in conjunction with the findings of Kerry Whale, in conjunction with the findings of Richard Grusin, I have tried to posit the animal turn as well as the non-human turn. Then we have moved into the field of animal studies, which is a recent phenomena for that matter. But animal studies has focused on the category of the animal, and it stands distinct from the animal rights discourse, which focuses more on animal cruelty, and it has more philosophical and legal perspectives than animal studies per se. I have also brought in the observations made by Horkheimer and Adorno, who talks about the rational man, the Aristotelian man, as behaving in a very, very irrational manner when it comes to the question of the animal. And the lecture had also tried to review certain terminologies and certain binaries between the human and the non-human animal. And then at the last, I have talked about the emergence of critical animal studies. Someone like Gary Wolf, Donna Harvey, they are significantly, involved in this turn towards the critical animal studies. And the fact that it is critical means that it has to be of the immediate present. So they are more activists in nature. So a lot of theoretical speculations has been done, but now a time has come for the animal activists to take center stage, to demonstrate, to protest, and to bring about an immediate end to all forms of animal use, oppression, and cruelty. And the lecture ended with the possibility of ethics of care. And I have also quoted certain laws that are in operation. And the last slide was on animality studies. And I was referring to the findings of Michael Lundblad, where he, in a way, questions, eschews that we can no longer be focused on animal studies, but we have to look at the animality that connects the human and the non-human animal. Derrida, for that matter, wants all of us to talk about and to identify and understand the finitude that equates, brings close the human and the non-human animal. And by finitude, he means, the exposure, the vulnerability, the death that can equate the animal and the human. So this was the scope of lecture 16 of animal studies. And from there on, I moved into lecture 17 of animal studies. But the focus in lecture 17 was on India. and how animal studies is trying to, make an influence on academia for that matter. And what is unique about lecture 17 is that the Indian scenario stands quite different from the West. So our attitudes, the Indian attitudes towards the animal, stands in contrast to the attitude as displayed in the West. So there is a conflicting attitude that we will find in India as far as the animal question is concerned. So how has our lifestyles, thoughts been shaped by our cultures, human animal binary, and what about the conflicting attitudes? So I have spoken in detail about ahimsa and whether ahimsa was only to mean non-violence towards human beings, or whether it was to be extended beyond the human and include the non-human as well. So this was what I attempted to do in lecture 17 of animal studies. Lecture 18 and lecture 19 were obviously on disability studies. And it is also important for us to talk about disability, because I firmly believe in what Leonard J. Davis tells us, that we are all temporarily able-bodied. So those of us who are occupying a position of privilege, we are temporarily able-bodied. So there can be various ways through which we may lose out on that position of power and privilege, of ability, and become disabled. So disability, in fact, is not only a social construct, but very importantly, it is also a very fluid category. For that matter, one who is disabled now, I'm talking about, for example, a person who has physical impairment. So there could be various ways, methods through which he or she may try to overcome that impairment through Jaipur foot, for example, and he or she may not appear to be disabled or impaired anymore. So through rehabilitation courses, through medicine, through medical interventions, one can move from the category of the disabled to the non-disabled, and again, vice versa, from the non-disabled to the disabled. So this particular lecture has focused on the heart of contemporary disability studies and tried to unravel how disability is a social construct, for example, like gender, and it is positioned somewhere at the intersection of individuals and society. Then we move on to another significant point that I have made in the lecture, and I have brought in Amartya Sen, who makes a very critical observation and the link that he finds between poverty and disability. So for example, poverty can increase the risk of disability, and disability can increase the risk of poverty. So the suggestions made by Amartya Sen were obviously taken up, and the World Bank has also incorporated disability into its poverty assessment process. So from this particular point, I have also tried to talk about how disability as a minority discourse may stand different from other minority discourses. For example, pity, fear, charity are the obvious responses to disability. But our views on disability may not be overtly expressed, okay? As say racial bigotry views, etc., etc. Then I have spoken about the various models of disability, like religious model, charity model, medical model, rehabilitation model, and obviously the social model of disability. So the focus of my lecture was on the social model of disability. Then the focus has been on the various nomenclatures. How do you address people with disabilities? So addressing the people with disabilities was also important, whether it should be people first usage or not. So people with disabilities or disabled people, but it may vary over time and it may vary from person to person. There is also a critique of the social model, critique in the sense that if, there is Tom Shakespeare who talks about that overt focus on society takes, the focus away from the individual who is impaired or who is in pain. So the body in pain gets relegated. So is that something that we can afford to do? So probably a later intervention may come in where the various models may converge and provide a new model. Now, the other point of importance here is disability knowledge. So like disability knowledge can mean the knowledge provided by the disabled. So it's not that we have to learn to overcome pain. It could be how we learn to live with pain. So even in sexuality studies, quadriplegics, paraplegics may have a world of knowledge and information available to them, but it just needs us, those who are temporarily able-bodied, to acknowledge and implement and accept that knowledge. The last lecture, which was on disability studies, but again in the Indian context, and I have heavily relied on the Indian voices coming from the disability field. And there is one particular segment which talks about disability etiquette, how we can be polite and politically correct also when we are interacting with the disabled. So what are those rules of interaction, social interaction, that we should follow? But the problem with India is that, and again, this is something which is in stark contrast to the West, is that in India, it is the coming together of, class, caste, gender, which problematizes the experience and nature of disability for that matter. And I have spoken in details about Anita Ghai, who pinpoints this lacuna or lack in feminist discourse emanating from India. That when you're talking about Indian women and you're talking about Indian feminism, but there is a glaring oversight of the woman with disability in India. So these were some of the thrust areas of my lecture. And I have also mentioned that the disability rights movement in India is basically a kind of a post-independent phenomena. And the focus is on discrimination, on oppression, rights and privileges. And much like the Dalit movement, much like the socialist movement, much like the Naxalite movement, it all came after independence. And I have also spoken about certain acts which are in practice in India. I have spoken about the Persons with Disabilities Act. And this was basically the thrust of my lecture on disability studies coming from India.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for explaining about each and every lecture briefly. One student joined on Zoom, but right now he's not here. And then one student is watching the event on YouTube. He is yet to pose the question. Maybe we can wait for a minute.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes, ma'am. Just a second, ma'am. The student who is watching the event on YouTube has posted a query. I'll just repost it on the Zoom chat.
Okay.
Sir, this is the question from Nidhi Upadhyay. Does anyone will be counted disabled only by the body, or it will include those who suffers from the mind?
Yes, absolutely. So Nidhi, for the
uninitiated, obviously, when you are talking about disability, we have to understand that, as I've mentioned in the lecture as well, that you have impairment, disability, and handicap. So these are the various categories, but we normally do not even understand the differences between the terms. Because of paucity of time and the compulsion of time, which we had to keep in mind when we were preparing these lectures, my lecture was specifically dealing with the physical aspect of impairment. But obviously, with so much exposure in today's world, we understand that mental illness, mental health is also a very, very important aspect of contemporary society. And there is absolutely a dire need to address it. But my focus in this particular lecture was primarily dealing with the very obvious manifestation of disability, that is through the physical impairments. Yes, Nidhi, you have understood this? Because, Rosemary Garland Thompson also talks about the stare. Like in feminist discourse, we are all familiar with the gaze, the male gaze. So similarly, in disability studies and disability studies discourse, there is this notion of the stare. And Rosemary Garland Thompson identifies this stare as this ocular response to something which is unpleasant. So I wanted to first introduce disability studies, something which is very new in India. And I wanted primarily to talk about the very obvious, something that is very visible, and tap into that, stigma that is very much there in Indian society.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering that question. Nidhi has posted that she understood. So would you like to add anything to ma'am's statement, sir?
I think she's an expert. Her specialization is on disability studies and animal studies. But as she said, disability studies is an embodied studies, and in the body, mind is also included. Okay, and its cultural studies, talks about culture not in the tangible form, but culture in intangible forms also. So people's feelings, people's thoughts, people's dreams, people's imaginations, they can also be part of cultural analysis. So disability studies is a method or as an area of studies, has to have this cultural approach into these intangible aspects of disability. Not only about the disabled person's own mentality, but also about the mentality of the able-bodied. So that's how mind and body both become part of cultural analysis. And cultural studies, therefore, teaches us how study and researches should be based not merely on facts, objects, but also on thoughts, feelings, rituals, dreams, imaginations, behaviors. Those are beyond the objects. So if body is the physical state, mind is the metaphysical state, the intangible thing. So in any kind of studies, you need to have both these, objects and the subjects. This is called sociology of literature, as Karl Mannheim would talk about. We need to look at the sociology, and sociology is not what you see only. Sociology is also how people think, feel, dream, imagine, react, and other things. So she said, right, and the question was good.
Yeah, if I may add another point to this, that again, you have to make a distinction between what is being done in the West, how disability is being perceived and understood and taken care of in the West, as opposed to something that is happening in India or South Asia. For example, disability rights movement, primarily in the West, will not probably give a lot of focus on the family or the caregiver. But when you come to the South Asian context, you will find that in most of the cases, the onus of care of the disabled lies with the family. And it is a very, very gendered care. Either it is going to be the mother, or it is going to be the wife, or it is going to be the sister. So this is again something that adds to the nuances of disability studies in India. So again, how there are cultural variations. So you have to keep in mind those minute, unsaid realities, facts, when you are trying to embark on a research on disability.
Thank you, ma'am.
So care is still not much of an issue. Right.
Let me just check whether any other query is posted on YouTube by the student. He told that he's having another query, but he's yet to post, ma'am. So we will wait for a minute or two.
Yeah.
Aparna, do you want to share your experience on this course?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aparna. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Aparna. I'm a TA of the course Aspects of Culture Studies, and I'm a research scholar working under Professor Dalai, sir. And it's been an honor to work with both the professors as well as the NPTEL team on this brilliant course. As everybody has already mentioned, this has been a course that has been an eye-opener of sorts, even to us teaching assistants, because it not only is it designed for a beginner, an absolute beginner, but even as a research scholar, you get a lot of aspects and new ideas from such course. So I really hope more students will make can get a good opportunity out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. So the examination for this course is on 25th of April. Would you like to discuss about the examination question patterns, those details?
Yeah. See, the examinations will be on MCQ pattern, and some of the questions are repeated from the weekly assignments. So it would not be very difficult for the students to, attempt correct answers. And the focus is basically on objective answers. Within the MCQ, you have objective answers, and those questions are based on factual objectivity. Just to make you understand the historicity or the conceptual clarity of a particular lecture. And as I've already shared in my brief outline, we have framed this course very elaborately, keeping in view the historicity of intellectual development in that particular area. For example, when we are talking about the importance of organic intellectualism, the lecture is also talking about who gave this concept and where do you find this, in which article of Antonio Gramsci's Notes from the Prison. So these historical factualities or facts are also kept in mind, so that students are not hooded means they are not kept at abeyance from the factual chronological developments, both in terms of facts and thoughts, right? So each lecture has many concrete information and facts to learn. And the total lectures, therefore, would be quite appropriate for you, would be enough to not only to pick up the development of or the emergence and gradual development of cultural studies, but how, while framing a course or framing your research proposal for PhD or for your project, you can think what things you are supposed to deal with in a particular project or thesis. Like the way we have devised this course can be a model for others, how to devise your or frame your own research proposal or outline your chapters in your thesis as a PhD student, even submit a proposal for projects and other things. So obviously, I was slightly diverting towards the nature of the course, but the tests would be based, the final test would be based on MCQs. So please try to remember the dates, the theories, and particularly the concepts. For example, New Left. So who coined New Left? Organic intellectualism. What were the other concepts also associated with organic intellectualism? And let me take this opportunity to again humbly confess, I have, in that lecture given a new concept. In the sense, I have introduced a concept given by E.P. Thompson. And that concept is hardly or rarely spoken by any, academics. And that is Natopolitanism. And it has its own history, brilliant history of this concept. Natopolitans were against, a group of scholars who were opposite of organic intellectualism. Organic intellectuals were those who were participating in the public issues. They combined the classrooms with the public. Not only did they, they did not merely depend on the rhetorical speeches or lectures, but they combined the classroom, their speeches with the activities. But there were also other scholars who did not do this. And those scholars can be called Natopolitan scholars or Natopolitanism, the idea of being silent, not speaking about, keeping mum, keeping, indifferent as scholars or activists, indifferent to the public problems issues. E.P. Thompson talks about. So this is a new concept, my dear students, that you hardly find in any other lectures. And unless you are interested in politics, in political science, in the development of intellectuality, you may not come. And not only reading, but sometimes you need to have critical thoughts, how you can explain organic intellectualism better. So when you keep on digging the treasures of intellectualism, you come across many things and you combine. So therefore, I have spoken about organic intellectualism, and I have also brought in Natopolitanism, so that you have a comprehensive, complete idea of who is an organic intellectual and who is a Natopolitan scholar. So as I was telling, this course will immensely help.
Definitely, sir. This course is going to help our students, learners a lot.
Thank you.
And then there is a question again posted by Nidhi. So I reposted it here. I will just read it, ma'am, sir. I recently watched a movie, Forensic, and I am so confused with the portrayal of the villain as an unaware and misguided by the society. But he changed his gender and became a serial killer of the children's. But still at the end, they treated him as he himself suffered. But this was not the truth. That's what he has, the student has posted. So would you like to, you're muted, sir.
So as a cultural critic, therefore, how do you approach this paradox of, heroism and villainism, isn't it? So we can't basically reduce that villain onto himself or reduce the disguised character or identity or actions that he does onto himself. Okay, so that would be reductive understanding of the villain, who the character becoming a villain. So what do? We therefore look into the contexts, the cultures in which he is brought up, he is carrying out his profession, he is carrying out his sinful acts, his thoughts, his dress, his look, his psychology, everything So all these are parts of what we call as culture. The living world of that hero or the villain is what matters to us as a cultural critic. For example, let me take you to Macbeth. If you have read Macbeth, we can't blame Macbeth entirely for killing the king. Macbeth is not just a biological entity as a man and a general and murdering there. Macbeth is very much product of his time and society. There were so many Macbeths in the Elizabethan England. So how do we understand Macbeth? Not from the perspective of Macbeth as just a character, but Macbeth as a part, as an individual of the Elizabethan society. So what is called a hero should be a cultural estimation. What is called villainy should also be a cultural interpretation. So that is why we are talking about the binary between Ram and Ravan. And we are questioning how Ravan is painted like a villain, despite being a Brahmin, or despite being a wise man. So this is how cultural studies empowers us to look at the reality from the perspective of culture or phenomenology. Right.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, would you like to add anything to the...
No, I was actually looking at...
muted, ma'am. You are muted, ma'am.
I was actually looking at the first question that
Okay.
Nidhi had posted.
Right, ma'am.
And there is this particular word that she has used, suffers, right? So because we are dealing with language, and obviously language leads to literature, this is from disability studies perspective that I'm trying to explain the usage of words, the value-laden words. So in disability discourse, there will be issues with the fact that suffering is always ascribed to the disabled. So how language needs alteration, or the use of language needs alteration. For example, we very often use the term wheelchair bound. A particular individual is wheelchair bound. That takes away or strips the agency of the impaired. Why not rather reframe it as a wheelchair user? As simple as that. Another example, like someone has AIDS, or for that matter, has cancer. So rather than saying he is someone dying from cancer, why not say living with cancer? So these are some very pertinent but very common, mistakes that we will notice everywhere in newspapers, in literature, in media. And therefore, it is important that disability studies, or for that matter, disability course, is introduced at the very basic level in schools as part of the education policy. So disability is not something which is a karmic fallout. I have talked about the various models of disability. So the religious model is there. The charity model is there. So how we have to recondition those who are temporarily able-bodied, we have to recondition ourselves into accepting disability, not as marginalized, but adding to the diversity. So they are adding to the difference. They are adding to the diversity. As simple as that. So we will be cautious and careful about how we speak, how we write. when we are talking about disability.
Thank you, ma'am. One student has joined now. Neha Prasad, do you have any doubts? Our instructors are here. Please unmute yourself and ask if you have any doubts.
No, sir, I joined late, so I don't have any doubt right now.
All right. So in that case, you can watch this event. It will be on the YouTube. And then if you have any queries, you can post it on the discussion forum. Right. Let me just check whether any questions are there on YouTube. Nidhi says, thank you so much, ma'am and sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's almost 3, sir. So can we end the session now, sir?
Yeah, I think we should call it a day.
Sure, sir. Definitely, sir. So thank you so much for your valuable time, sir, ma'am, and then our TA Aparna. Nice meeting you all.
Thank you.
It was a nice experience. And once again, thanks to all the participants who have registered and who have joined and who have had the benefits of this course. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Bye,
sir.
Aparna.
Thank you.
Yes. We are closing now. Yeah. Thank you.